Welcome back. In this video, I'll be talking about language learning contexts. In Chapter 3, Hummel profiles naturalistic contexts and instructed second language acquisition. In this video, I'll be focusing on naturalistic contexts, and I'll be limiting my commentary mainly to immigration. So let's start with a definition. What do we mean by a naturalistic context? Well, it's also called untutored second language acquisition, and it happens when there's little or no guided intervention on the part of the social environment. So it's language acquisition in its natural habitat, if you will, and of course a classic example is that of immigrants who have to perform work and daily activities in their second language. They have communicative pressure in order to perform these activities, even if they don't speak the language very well. And for most immigrants, taking a formal language class is a luxury. Why should we study naturalistic contexts? Well, I'd like to read this quote from Klein and Dimroth, which I think is very important. They state that untutored second language acquisition is not something exotic, it is the normal case. And if we want to understand the very principles according to which the human mind constructs, copies, and uses linguistic systems, then we must study how human beings cope with this task when not under the influence of teaching. Let's talk about some of the main features of naturalistic second language acquisition. These are not in your book, but I think it's really important to go over them. First of all, in a naturalistic context, learners are very rarely corrected as long as their meaning is being communicated, right? So if they're able to express a meaning, then most interlocutors will not correct them. Second point, language is not presented step by step, which is of course very different from a classroom context. So they won't first get gender agreement and then move on to the subjunctive or something like this. Language is coming at them all at once, and it's not being presented in any kind of linear fashion. The third point, the learner is surrounded by the language. Some of it may be addressed to the learner directly, and some of it is overheard. So that's also very important. The fourth point is that the learner will encounter a number of different speakers of the language in any given day, right? This is also very different from a typical language classroom in which learners are only exposed to their teacher as a model. And the fifth point about modified input. Well, modified input is basically when the speaker will slow down or make modifications such as repeating things. That is going to be available generally in a one-to-one setting, but not in a larger group setting. I want to tell you about a couple of studies that have been done on naturalistic acquisition, one classic study and then also some more recent work. So a classic study that you should become familiar with was carried out by the European Science Foundation in the 1980s. And it's a really large-scale study in which recent immigrants to 5 different European countries were tracked, and they were studied for 30 months, so quite a long time. One of the main findings of this study was the existence of what they called a basic variety, which was characterized by a rudimentary lexicon and a lack of morphological agreement, morphological inflection or marking. So for example, number, gender, tense, and other morphological markers were absent. And what was particularly interesting is that 1/3 of the participants remained at this basic level throughout the study, so they didn't seem to make any improvement or progress. One of the possible outcomes of second language acquisition in a naturalistic context is that a speaker may develop considerable fluency, but not formal accuracy. So fluency refers to rate of speech and natural pauses, for example, whereas accuracy refers to the absence of error, right? So these two components of oral speech often compete with each other. And what we find in naturalistic learners is that they can develop tremendous fluency, but again, their formal accuracy or their grammatical accuracy in particular may suffer. There's another component that's often studied, which is complexity, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Another possible outcome in a naturalistic context is something called fossilization. Now, fossilization does appear in your textbook, but it's not going to come up until chapter 6. You can take a look there if you want to. But basically, fossilization is the fact that errors or non-target-like structures become permanent for the learner despite many, many years of residence in the target country. Right, so here's two examples from somebody in my family that has been in the United States for over 30 years, and they make questions of the kind that you see here. Why he did that, what this card does. So this is a typical stage in English question formation in which the learner will front the WH word. So the question begins with a WH word, but does not manifest any of the other characteristics of an English question with the do support. Let's move on now to a recent study. This was done by Polat and Kim, published in 2013 in the journal Applied Linguistics. A very interesting study in which they studied a Turkish native speaker who was living in the United States. And it's a longitudinal study, so that means that they collected data over 1 year and wanting to see what the development was in this particular speaker. They conducted many oral interviews, and that data was analyzed for complexity and accuracy. They looked in particular at syntactic complexity and also lexical diversity. So lexical diversity is basically the number of different words that you use in your speech or in your writing. This is an oral sample here. Their results showed that this learner made no improvement in grammatical accuracy over time. However, the learner did show development, quite a bit of development in lexical diversity. So what they conclude here, and I'll be reading from their abstract, is that an untutored language learner may develop advanced lexical skills, but achieving grammatical accuracy without instruction may be more difficult. They also looked at syntactic complexity, and the data there was not very convincing. I'd like to finish up this video by briefly talking about study abroad. Now, in your textbook, study abroad appears as a naturalistic context, but what I want you to think about is that study abroad is this unique case. It may not be either naturalistic or instructed. It may be some kind of hybrid of both, right? And the experiences of study abroad students can be really very different, even if they're on the same program together. You're going to be listening to a podcast about this, so I won't say too much more about it, but I want you to think about this question before you listen or as you listen. So one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that we can't assume that second language learners will be immersed in the speech community during study abroad. There are going to be numerous factors that could affect their contact with native speakers during study abroad. So can you think of some of these factors that might impact the amount of contact they have? All right, now you're ready to listen to the podcast, and I'll see you in class.